Jennifer knows a lot about this subject, and she's going to tee up a little bit of background for us, and then we'll get into the panel and then the Q&A. Jennifer, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, James, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to be here today to just start the discussion for the ICAO NOTAM panel. We have a great set of panelists, and then also Caroline Doucette from Nav Canada is going to give their perspective on their ICAO NOTAM transition. So we can just go to the next slide. As you may know, the FAA is implementing the ICAO NOTAM format. We're doing this to align with international standards and targeting winter of 2024. Our mission for this transition is to provide high quality, discoverable, and accessible ICAO compliant NOTAMs. Now, how are we going to do that? We're going to update policies and procedures to incorporate the standards and recommended practices provided by ICAO. We're going to update the 7930.2 notices to airmen and the Advisory Circular 150-5200-28 notice to airmen for airport operators. There will be additional orders and procedures that will need to be updated, but this is really where we're going to start as the basis for our ICAO NOTAM policy. We can go to the next slide. And just looking, this is going to benefit everyone on this line today. And we'll look at exactly how. So starting with our pilot community, it's really going to give you the ability to access the right NOTAMs at the right time. For the air carriers, we've already heard in the conversation today, they're really looking to have the same format for domestic and international operations. The good news is it's coming. For flight plan service providers, it does allow for enhanced sorting and filtering capabilities. For the FAA, it really allows us to increase our global harmonization with our neighboring air navigation service providers by making US NOTAMs compliant with the standards set by ICAO. And we've already touched on policy. It's really going to let us be standardized with the international community. We've already received a lot of great questions, but please start posting your questions in the chat window, and we'll be glad to start answering those as soon as the panel starts. And we can go to the next slide. And really, how are we going to get there? So there's going to be a phased approach. ICAO Phase 1 is targeted for release in spring of 2022. It's going to be available in the NOTAM search website and NOTAM distribution service, NDS data feed. It'll be for the digitally originated NOTAMs, which is approximately 70% of the NOTAMs the FAA currently transmits. These translations will use the same ICAO formatting as the draft ICAO NOTAM policy that will be implemented as the official format in Phase 2. And you may be asking, why are we doing a phased approach? And it's really because it'll have minimal impact to system owners downstream. It's going to allow us to improve the qualifier line in the NOTAMs we currently have in the ICAO format. I would like to include, it will not include ICAO numbering and series, and that's an important distinction. The actual ICAO numbering and series will come in ICAO Phase 2. The FAA will continue to cross over the NOTAMs to the international states as we're currently doing, so that information will not be lost. The domestic FAA format will remain the official format into the ICAO NOTAM policy is implemented. And why are we doing this? And we feel that it's giving a time period for users to prepare for the transition of all NOTAMs to the ICAO format. When we transition to the next slide, you're going to see ICAO Phase 2 is the ICAO official format, and we can go to the next slide. Thank you. It's very similar to the current domestic format with the addition of the qualifier line. The qualifier line contains coded information, coordinates, and radius for areas for the automated filtering of NOTAMs. ICAO Phase 2 is when the FAA will fully transition to the ICAO NOTAM format, including formatting, numbering, series, and Q codes. For those of you that may be new to the ICAO NOTAM format, this NOTAM here is for runway 4 left, 22 right, closed at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Chicago O'Hare is located within the Chicago Flight Information Region. The effective time for the NOTAM is June 23rd, 2021 from 17 to 2300 Zulu. This example is used in the ICAO NOTAM format example on the ICAO NOTAM website, which will shortly be posted in the chat, and all elements and fields of the ICAO NOTAM format are defined and explained within that document. But as you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Just a little plug for the ICAO NOTAM website. There are some additional references for the stakeholder community. We currently have the ICAO NOTAM format example. For airport operators, there's an ICAO NOTAM 101, and that really gives a breakdown of each of the individual fields at a deeper level. And for our pilots, and it can be used for everybody, we have the ICAO NOTAM brochure. And that's just really a quick job aid or cheat sheet, whatever you want to call it, that will allow you to understand the ICAO NOTAM format just a little bit better. For the next discussion, I would like to introduce Carolyn Doucette, Manager, Standards and Procedures, Aeronautical Information and Information Flight Procedure Design at Nav Canada. Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss the Canadian transition to the ICAO NOTAM format. We're really looking forward to your presentation and for your insight for the panel. So over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for the opportunity to share our experience. I'm a firm believer in the notion that we can learn from each other's mistakes, but also our successes. And sharing ideas is how we're going to all get there faster together. Today, I'd like to share some insights and hopefully it'll give you some things to consider and maybe trigger some really good discussion for the panel. Next slide, please. If someone had asked me to summarize the experience of this transition, that would be the image I would show. It tells a story. The format itself, it's not perfect. The rules are not always straightforward, and many compromises had to be made. And we are still making some. Next slide, please. To give you a little bit of context, we were, of course, familiar with this format, just like the FAA is, crossing over a certain percentage, so about 20% for us, of our inventory in 4 series. We had limited filtering capabilities. Our legacy systems were reaching the end of their life. We had limited data in the right format in the database. We knew that the number of NOTAM was increasing. I think the animation is not following. I don't know if there's an extra click there. There you go. So the number of NOTAM in force was increasing, and we knew that filtering would become critical. So the benefits that we saw was compliance with Annex 15 and the PANZAME. For us, it's incorporated in our regulations, so we don't have a choice. But more than that, it's a step towards digital NOTAM, interoperable NOTAM data, one less format to learn, decipher for all of our pilots that fly in different countries, and one less customization of systems by our stakeholders. And the structure was envisioned to be leveraged for more granular filtering. Next slide, please. So in scope of the transition for us, we were going to decommission the uniquely Canadian NOTAM format, except for our NOTAM J, which is the same as the FICONs, introducing a new format and concept for Canadian users. And by that, I mean we are changing the culture a little bit. We're developing and introducing a new entry system. We were developing and introducing a new search system. Rewrite the policy, of course, our Canadian NOTAM procedures manual, and the communication, the training that goes with all this, and the adaptation of all the internal systems that are ingesting NOTAM, such as displays for controllers, DATIS, and so on. Next, please. Challenges. So we were starting with a NOTAM file system. This is just a container, a way to organize the NOTAM inventory. So we were going from 270 plus to a maximum of 24 series. So if you do the math, that's 10 times less the number of NOTAMs available. Not that we want to issue these many NOTAMs, that's not the point, but we needed to find a way to avoid rollover and have room to grow. We'll find a way to disseminate according to recipients' needs and requirements, because let's say our European stakeholders may not be interested in small water aerodromes. And this resulted in NOTAM regions, dissemination categories, and series based on subjects. But that choice created additional challenges. And I think any way you slice it, there would always be some challenges associated with using the NOTAM series. Then the IQ provision often offered too much flexibility, and the application of the different rules can be quite subjective. At times, there are too many codes that can be chosen for a given situation, or at times it's the opposite, none that seem to be a good fit. So in our attempt to fill in the blanks, we had to decide, do we give flexibility in the input, but now you have to explain how to make the right choice, the choice you want them to make, which becomes a very complex explanation. Or do you give no option at all, but then you lose this flexibility? The NOTAM format, IQ format, has more attributes. So that qualifier line that Jennifer showed us earlier, it means more data that needs to be provided. So we needed to decide who would bear the load. Is it the system? Is it the people, the originator, the NOTAM office? So this decision has to be made. Next slide, please. And just to show an example, so if you have a NOTAM like this one that's describing a certain volume of airspace, there might be, and let's say it's not a polygon that you have in the database, let's say a special use airspace, you need to extract the center coordinates and this radius of influence of this polygon. So I think if you click, we're gonna circle the right pieces of the information. So this needs to be translated in one set of coordinates and one radius, and the same for the above ground level value that we see in item golf. This needs to be somehow translated into a flight level for which you need the terrain elevation. So whenever these radiuses and coordinates vertical limits are not predefined, you have to make a decision. Who provides those, and do they know how? Do they have the skills? Do they have the tools, the knowledge, and so on? So if it's not predefined or automated, the burden is added on someone. So you might have to consider simplifying some of the rules. For example, for airways, ATS routes, instead of trying to match the exact altitude, the exact limits of these airspace, we decided to split between low level and high level. And for now, it's enough until we have proper data to be more granular with our choices. Next slide, please. Things we did well. While we had ATS personnel that came to our head office to supplement the NOF staff for a few weeks to convert the legacy format received on legacy systems and input them in the IQ format on the new system. That had a double benefit, is that our ATS staff learned a lot very quickly. We had a command center with an open phone line with our ATS units 24/7. We had system developers on site and on shift to assist the NOF and ATS personnel doing the work. And we had freed up developers' teams to address bugs on the fly, and of course, making quick decisions even about the policy for things we had not addressed or had fell in the cracks. And as much planning as we did, and as you will do, that might still happen. Things to improve. Next slide, please. So we assumed that our NOF, our NOTAM office, would be okay because they had been handling NOTAMs for such a long time. But we failed to recognize that there were many subjects that we had never put in this format, and therefore failed to recognize how difficult the choices might be. Our policy document doesn't have every example. It shows only some examples. And this is where the difficult choices are when there are no examples. We didn't put enough emphasis, I think, on ensuring the originators, airport operators, regulator, military, ATC knew what to provide and how to find this information. We didn't understand how much harder our staff would have to work to make these decisions, how much time they would need to validate their entries. And lastly, we only had a few filtering features at the rollout in our search tool, and probably not a bad thing considering the search system will only be as good as the quality of the NOTAM itself. And if the NOTAM attributes are inconsistent and the search functions are based on those, you might be increasing the risk of missing critical information. So you must have this quality output before putting all the bells and whistles in your filtering system. Next slide, please. Okay, you won't be able to read this, and that's not intended. Just focus on the color. When preparing for the summit, I was asked if there were some aha moments, and there were. Our new system, it allows us to export the data, all the NOTAM published on an Excel, and of course you can manipulate the data once on Excel. And for the first time, we were able to see the big pictures of where the issues were. The NOTAM output that you're looking at, this was the exact same NOTAM issued about 200 times in a year. The text was identical, but there were 21 permutations of the Q line. And this was one of those NOTAMs that there were no example in our policy manual. So you've heard me say that there's subjectivity in how to apply the format. What you're seeing is the NOTAM text only, and there are many reasons why there are these inconsistencies. It could be human factor, lack of examples, subjectivity, and so on. But it did tell me how difficult it would be to choose subject codes and the importance of understanding the usage and concept of each attribute in the qualifier line. Because when people make a choice about choosing VFR versus IFR, they apply an internal logic. So we need to all be on the same page when we apply those. Otherwise, you need to automate the whole shebang. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. So hindsight is 2020. If we had to do it again, I think there would be more testing. The testing of the output, this will inform your next decisions, how you need to support, whether you remove the flexibility. To be interoperable, I believe we need to be predictable with our choices. Some gentlemen earlier mentioned sharing the decoder ring. For me, that's key. There are not enough codes to describe every subtle outage subjects for which there doesn't seem to be any code that fits. But maybe we can agree to use the same closest, even if it doesn't make perfect sense, but at least we'll be predictable. And of course, you reach out to your stakeholders and you take a pulse often. So that's it for me. Thank you for the opportunity to share our experience, and I'll see you on the panel. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I'm going to hand it back over to James Linney.
Thank you, ma'am. And thank you very much, Caroline. I appreciate that. And we appreciate your partnership as well in our previous conversations where we talked about lessons learned and benefits. As always, a lot we can learn from each other. So I'm going to ask the panelists who are going to be on to turn on their cameras and microphones. We're going to introduce them one at a time. Again, Heidi needs no introduction again, but welcome back. Thank you, Heidi. We'll go first to Jennifer Ellison, and I'll ask this group the questions that we asked the others. What are you looking forward to? What are you excited about? Why are you happy to be here today?
Thank you again, James. I'm really excited to be here because I'm passionate about aviation safety and process improvement. And the NOTAM modernization and ICAO NOTAM format transition really encompasses both of those. So I'm really excited to just share and see what feedback and discussion is towards this change.
Thank you, ma'am, and thanks for that great introduction setup too. Jerry Torres, to you, sir. Same question.
Thanks, James. I'm glad to be here. I have a few comments I want to share in terms of our sincere appreciation with Nav Canada for sharing the insights and lessons learned. I also want to say that we have been actively reviewing and closely reviewing their notes that they shared to ensure that we're able to leverage from those situations that perhaps may require a little bit more attention. So again, our sincere appreciation to Caroline and the Nav Canada team. Sincerely appreciated. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to provide an insight into the ICAO NOTAM governance and policy. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Jerry. And our most valuable player from the first panel, well, most called upon player at least, next, Jerry Gross. So Jerry, thanks and welcome back again. I don't see her up here yet, but I'm sure she'll come off camera in a second.
Here I am.
Yes. Oh, there you are. Thank you.
Good afternoon, all. Again, thanks to James and Jennifer for allowing me to be on this panel. And so my excitement here is really around the fact that aviation is a global industry. And I think, back to the point from the previous panel around data sharing and information sharing. And the more we do that in a standardized way that all users can interpret the same information in their particular systems and the way they need it around standardization is really what I am excited and glad to see the agency moving in that direction.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jerry. Caroline, anything else you wanted to add? Great introduction as well, so thank you.
I'm excited to be here because adopting a unique format is crucial to achieve this global ATM with interoperable data. However, there's still always work to be done even once you've adopted a format. So summits like this, I think they're essential to align, and we must continue to have these conversations, continue to do a pulse check to ensure we remain aligned. So I thank you for this opportunity.
Wonderful, thank you. George Hudson, we have on from Southwest Airlines. Introductory thoughts about why you're happy to be here today.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. It's been a long time that I've been interested in NOTAM reform, both as a user, as a pilot for many years, and also as an airport operations, as a participant in airport operations over the last few years before Southwest. So I have a unique perspective, both in, from an airport side of things and from a pilot side. So it's a subject near and dear to my heart.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here very much. Appreciate it. And last but not least on our panel today, Jeff Miller from International Air Transport Association. Jeff?
Hi, James. Hi, Heidi. Thank you, Carolyn, for the presentation. I've been on the coalition since the very beginning, and that in itself excites me. The AIS and NOTAM modernization is a key pillar with regards to aviation safety and infrastructure. So very excited about that. To be a little bit more granular, the significance of this modernization, this change in content, context, and scope is, well, I haven't experienced this. I've been in aviation for 30 years. So that's all very exciting. And if I could, James and Heidi, I would like to thank you for your continuing support to the international airline community, both in our industry meetings and for the consistency of the message that comes out each and every time in the progress of the AIS coalition. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you all again for joining us. If you're not speaking, remember to mute your microphones, everybody. And for those who are going to come off mic, raise their hand, introduce yourself. It might help to just sort of know where you're from and what industry segment. It's a small world, but we don't all know everybody else, so please feel free to do that. And again, use the chat function or feel free to raise your hand if you want to contribute to the conversation or ask a question verbally. So Heidi, you want to go to our Q&A?
I'd love to. Thank you to each of the panelists for your participation today. Really appreciate it. And I think we have had a few robust discussions already with our ICAO ad hoc group that is part of the coalition and that transition. So I think today will be an extension and a continuation of that discussion. So we're looking forward to it. And thank you, Jennifer, for your leadership in this area. Really appreciated. So maybe we'll kick it off to Jerry Torres, if you don't mind, sir. First question, maybe help us better understand the difference between ICAO NOTAM system and our current FAA NOTAM system. I'm not sure that we all understand the differences.
Sure. So among the key differences ushered in by ICAO, the ICAO NOTAM format allows for better automation, sorting, and prioritization. And it also makes NOTAM machine readable, which is something that we didn't have that, which we currently don't have. And that's going to make a tremendous change in the way we, manage the NOTAMs. And ICAO also divides NOTAMs by series, whereas the FAA is using keywords. So once we transition over to full ICAO, a lot of these workarounds that we have implemented will go away, and then we'll be more or less in harmony with the ICAO.
Very good. Thank you. Appreciate the discussion there. So maybe we'll jump over to Jerry, if you don't mind. We have a question, and this is a topic that has come up many times, right? I think it came up in the chat feature under the last discussion that we had on data, but lots of energy around Q codes, right? So maybe a question there, Jerry. So since we're converting NOTAMs into from domestic to an ICAO format, how do we convert existing NOTAM series into the classification and NOTAM category? And then maybe a second part of that is are we using the Q code because based on the research of many NOTAMs, we don't have the proper Q code in the selection code XML element, and some only exist within text itself. There's a whole lot to that question, Jerry. So let's start with at least the first part of it, right? About the NOTAM series and the classification and NOTAM category.
Eddie, this is for Jerry Gross from the PMO or for me?
It's for Jerry Gross, I believe. But Jerry, if you want to jump in here too, please. I think both of you.
I certainly would like to have Mr. Torres help me with that, and I'll however I can.
Sure. So I've got the Dakota ring for the policy side in terms of where we're going, considering the Q codes. And certainly that's a topic of interest, I'm sure, to many. And of course, we'll be using the ICAO Q codes listed in the document 8126, Aeronautical Information Services Manual. We will also consider adopting best practices in NOTAM codes that support the United States National Airspace System operations. So although the ICAO document contains a significant amount of Q codes, certainly we're going to have to determine which one better align with what we're using, as well as those have been proven to be effective in terms of the management of NOTAMs.
Great, thanks, Jen. Or Jerry, do you have anything to add there on the Q codes? Jen, I know we've had a lot of discussion on this in our meetings, right?
We have, and the good news is we're going to use the Q codes along with the NOTAM series. So right now, the FAA is exploring 13 NOTAM series, 4 FAA issued NOTAMs, and then also the DoD, so the Department of Defense, also uses 6 NOTAM series currently. So that's going to be 2 ways to kind of distinguish the data. Also, it's really going to help with our metadata, say that 3 times fast, but it's really going to give us, help us define which codes we're going to use for which series. And for the digital NOTAMs that are going to be issued, and as we go along, hoping to increase our digital footprint, the scenario element in the AXA message can be used to identify the specific topic of the NOTAM event. So it's really going to be kind of 3 different things. We're going to use the NOTAM series, NOTAM code, and then for our digitally originated NOTAMs, we're going to use the scenario. But it's definitely a topic that we are putting a lot of thought into, and we'll continue to have conversations throughout the next probably 12 to 18 months.
Great. I'm glad that you added that little bit onto it, because I think there's a lot of thought and input that has been put into this from the vendor and industry communities. And I think they have a good bit to share here. So I think we're anxious to hear from some of those folks. And if they want to jump in, now's the time, right? We're right in the midst of our Q&A with the panel. So happy to have folks jump in. And maybe I'll pose another question. So Jerry Torres, for you, one of the principal guidelines for ICAO NOTAMs is NOTAM brevity, right? I think this is a topic, not just for ICAO NOTAMs, but NOTAMs in general. So has there been any discussion internally within the FAA regarding the multi-part NOTAMs that are issued by a center, and then removing the legal language and focusing on just the facts? I know all of us want to get to the point, right? So how do you tackle that?
Well, that's a good question, Heidi, in the sense that this is not the first time we've heard that question asked. And as you know, a lot of times the legalese or the legal language in these documents are required based on the, the internal policies concerning the publication of information. However, we agree that we really want to make the messaging in the NOTAMs very direct and clearly understood, which, and I know it goes to another topic that addresses the contractions and maybe going more to plain language type NOTAMs. And this was discussed earlier this morning concerning why we couldn't go to plain language. So as we know, that also increases the number of pages in the NOTAM, which goes against what we're planning to, trying to keep them very succinct and not have 24 pages of NOTAMs where a lot of the information is kind of buried in the lower levels of the document. So that's one item. But concerning the legalese, I know we've heard this before. Certainly we'll engage again to see what we can do to minimize or at least eliminate the language. But again, that's something that's going to be difficult because it's been an established policy for a while. But certainly we can take a look at that and have those conversations again to see how we can improve that messaging.
That's great, Jerry. Thank you. And maybe one, I don't know if this is fair, but I'm going to pose it, and maybe others on the panel want to jump in. But why are the ASA NOTAMs shorter in language than those issued by the FAA? Any thoughts or input there? And if not, that's okay, right? Can't always speak for another ANSP. But.
I can comment on this. There are pros and cons in trying to use plain language because now you open the door for synonyms to be used, which means like people will start wondering if something different is meant. A contraction abbreviation is always spelled the same way, so there's benefits there. Even for people that don't speak English, they'll recognize it. And I think we will not, I don't think, eliminate completely those abbreviations, contractions. Nobody wants to read VOR full length is in a NOTAM, ILS full length is in a NOTAM. I think that would become too heavy. So ICAO, there's a working group right now, and we are looking into that, like which one should we keep and which one are not advisable.
That's great, Carolyn. Thank you for that insight. That's helpful. Maybe to Jeff and George, do you guys have any thoughts? I mean, I'm sure you're hearing from your operators, your member companies on brevity and contractions and plain language. Thoughts to offer here?
I do know one of the concerns that I've seen voiced in the past is slight variations in the contractions and the abbreviations that are used. And there's examples out there that show and they're not far apart, but they are far enough apart where you have to look at them. And I guess part of the concern is the member states and ICAO, everybody has slightly different guidance and takes on exactly what should be in a NOTAM and the abbreviations. So that's one thing I'd like to see is the abbreviations settled on. Everybody come together for an agreement, the contractions, that type thing.
The standardization is always desirable, right? When we can achieve it. And I recognize not always optimal, but it's certainly a great goal. Jeff, thoughts there?
Thank you, Heidi. And firstly, thank you, Jennifer, for leading this huge initiative. It's I don't know if the community can thank you enough for this, but in any case, the feedback that I've been getting, Heidi, is what the information is that's going to be available, what's not going to be available in phase 1 and other phases. They would like to know what the differences might be early on phase 1 as compared to future phases in relationship to the ICAO compliant NOTAMs. And so I think that just information and just knowing a constant communication feed of just the status and where we're at, I think that will greatly assist in their preparation, both for the operators and for those flight planning automation vendors as well. Just knowing what to expect, when to expect it, and what they need to do to get ready for it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I suspect Jen wants to jump in here because she's done a lot of work on trying to help us understand what phase 2 encompass, what we can expect, the examples out there and our timeline. So Jen, I'm sure you have thoughts here.
I really do. And I don't want to put Jerry Gross on the spot here, but I kind of like the idea of doing a demo. Like if we do a demo for the API, maybe we could do a demo on phase 1, just, you know, and it wouldn't have to be long. It could be like maybe 5 or 10 minutes as a consolidated presentation and say, this is exactly what it is. This is what it's not. Go a little bit deeper dive. I know we covered it in like 2 minutes here, which obviously was not enough. So I like that idea, but I wanted to see, Jerry, if you agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. The more engagement and demo and look ahead of what data will look like that we can offer, I really think, you know, that's something that we can do and use the forums that we have, which is the coalition here, the SWIFT and other forums. So my team and I would be happy to do those demos. The phase 1 and phase 2, you might go a little bit more into it, Jennifer, but I'll just start that response a little bit in that in phase 1, in terms of what we're really doing there is providing the view, if you will, of what all of our domestic NOTAMs look like in the ICAO format. And that will be available in our NOTAM search capability, so that users can really get familiar with that format, the series that we're talking about, the Q codes, being able to offer an early look and view at that. And then in phase 2 is when we'll do the full cutover later on in the 2024 timeframe. But that early release of phase 1 was really intended to just start giving users the look and feel of what an ICAO NOTAM looks like with that new format around series and Q codes.
Thanks, Jerry. I think that's helpful. And I don't think this is the last discussion we're going to have, right? I know with phase 1 and phase 2, Jen, we've had this discussion offline a number of times. I mean, we've talked about it in all of our meetings so far, but I think there's sometimes still a lack of clarity. And I think once we see it, we'll get it, right? So those seem like a great idea. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So Jerry, maybe a question for you. We recently, and this is one of our users, right? So industry partners, we've recently experienced an example just last week where a Jacksonville NOTAM were not converted over into the ICAO format. Why are select NOTAMs from the same maybe aerodrome converted into ICAO while others are not? And I think we had a similar question in the last panel, but love for you to tackle this one again.
Okay, so that particular topic, we have been discussing that specific incident. And so I'm going to turn that question over to my team and the governance team, John Warner, who's been working the policy side, but I know that's been kind of vexing for us as well. But I'm sure John can be able to give you a little bit more clarity on that.
Okay.
You with us, John?
Thanks. So that the question on the Jackson Hole NOTAM has to do with the not all NOTAMs are crossed over, as in the keywords and the pretty much the classification. They were originally crossovers were determined through meetings and collaboration with stakeholders, and then identified of which NOTAMs need to be crossed over, into the international format. The ones that were left out on this one were the weather ones, dealing with the weather system outage and the altimeter setting not available also. So just so you know, on the background, that's what we're discussing right here. So at this time, weather NOTAMs are not crossed over into international. And this is, again, something that would have to be determined, because if we determined that we would cross those over, that would affect every airport, which, as we stated before, is a manual process. So that increases the workload. So we have discussions going on with that on how we want to approach it this time. The thing is that, as mentioned before, the domestic NOTAM is the official NOTAM and not the ICAO NOTAM. So at this time, the user may need to, reach out and to bring all those NOTAMs in for that destination to make sure that the pilots and the users are aware of them until we can come up with a solution on this, but there are discussions going on.
Thanks, John. That's helpful. Appreciate the additional insight into Jerry. So I think we had one that was in the chat feature. It might have been answered in the chat, but I think it's worth verbally at least reviewing. The question is, can we be provided with a proposed listing of the ICAO series codes? And will the FAA be working with Nav Canada and others to develop a list of the most frequently used Q codes so that industry knows what to expect rather than any obscure Q code combinations potentially? Jennifer or Jerry, either one.
Okay, so from our side, we've been working to ensure that whatever functionality we introduce concerning ICAO does not come as a surprise to our stakeholders. So we're going to go through a great effort to ensure that we try to standardize as much as possible to ensure that, we kind of make that transition over successfully. But a point I want to bring up is that certainly, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at lessons learned as we discussed with Nav Canada. We're going to take a look at that, but also as well obtain feedback from the users, because we want to make sure that when we do the transition to ICAO, nothing is left behind, and ensuring that, the expectations are there. So certainly we need to have that outreach with the users to also give us that feedback. That's important in terms of what they're anticipating, because we don't want them to cross over into ICAO and then have a lot of wondering to say, what is this and what is that? This should not be a surprise as we make that transition over. So we're going through great pains to make sure that we're, comprehensive in that effort.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe a related topic there, Jerry, while we have you talking about this. Do you think we're going to be creating our own specific US specific Q codes like TFR or NOTAM or FICON or something that's not within the 8126?
Well, so that's a good point you mentioned, Heidi, because as you know, the United States has taken exceptions in the past to ICAO. So because of the, what I say, uniqueness of our national airspace system operations, there's always that possibility that we may adhere to our own internal, codes or et cetera. But we want to make sure, for the most part, that we do align as much as possible because those codes are there. But certainly there are going to be some exceptions that we anticipate, because obviously we're not going to be able to transition 100% to full ICAO because of the uniqueness of what we do here in the United States.
Yeah, so Jen, maybe have you go, but George and Jeff, just something to be thinking about, because I'd like to get your input after Jen shares your thoughts about the Q codes. You both have had great input in the past during our ad hoc meetings about Q codes and the criticality there. But if you have some feedback to offer after Jen shares, love to hear from you.
I do. Yeah, just second what Jerry Torres mentioned. We are going to ensure we're collaborating with different ANSPs throughout the international states. We're also going to be collaborating with industry. Bringing that up, I would like to mention we do have a ICAO NOTAM ad hoc stakeholder group that meets the second Tuesday of every month. If you're interested, we'll again share the website. It'll give you a link and information on how you participate in that group. It's co-chaired by Heidi Williams and myself. So we'd love you to join us if you're interested on getting a monthly update and giving some of your suggestions. I did want to circle back right before we jump back into the Q code discussion on the international crossover NOTAMs that the FAA is currently crossing over. For the categories or keywords that are going to be crossed over, there is going to be a document that's going to be shared after the event that shows you. It's not necessarily going to show you what we don't cross over, but it will show you what we do cross over. Please expect that as further explanation for the topic that we just saw and then in the previous panel. Moving back over to the Q code conversation, I really would like to invite George or Jeff to input on that.
Well, from my perspective, the Q codes are probably the most concerning aspect of this, the transition to ICAO NOTAMs of anything. And that's just the number of Q codes that are out there. And then within the Q codes, there's other permutations. So it ends up being a huge number of possibilities. And I heard this a couple of years ago at the International Air Safety Summit, Flight Safety Foundation. And Captain Vernet there, he was talking, and it set off alarm bells in my head because being from France, he's been using ICAO NOTAMs his whole career. And they were still talking about the difficulties with the number of Q codes. And the problem with that is airport operators, let's say if they're inputting NOTAMs, they don't necessarily know which Q code to use or which permutation of the Q code to use. So it ends up falling into different categories from what you would anticipate. And it makes the NOTAMs that much harder to sort for the systems out there that try and prioritize the NOTAMs. So that's my biggest concern, is not so much from the user perspective, from reading the NOTAMs, because I think they're close enough where most flight crew and pilots will be able to interpret them properly. I think what the real problem is going to be is those putting in the NOTAMs, getting them in the right categories so we can in future prioritize.
Yeah, and Carolyn, I saw you shaking your head and now you have your hand raised. So I think you probably have learned from your experiences. We'd love to hear from you.
Oh, you know what? I smile internally because for me, it's a confirmation that, we reached the right conclusion, if you will. But it's exactly that. I think it's one thing to standardize within one state, one country, but for me, that's not enough. It's everybody has to use the same code. If we use, let's say, runway limited MRLT for a certain scenario, we should all apply it the same way. And that's going to be a challenge because we have regional differences, cultural differences, different ways of expressing something. And we're not even talking about the NOTAM text, but the way we are presented with scenario drives the choices. It drives the choices that we make for the codes. So I think the key is to, I hate to say it because we lose flexibility, but it's remove some of these options. You remove the subjectivity from the equation.
Jeff, I thought you came off mute, but I'm not hearing you.
Thank you. I was actually waiting for you to call on me. So thanks, Heidi, and Carolyn. Excellent observations. George as well. I'm going to stick to the IATA mantra, which is harmonization. I think that I know that the more we can engage that commonality with regards to the Q codes, the better off we'll all be. That would decrease the ramp up time and the training time for pilots and operators to decipher what codes are actually there and what's before them. And then for those codes that are dissimilar, just really understanding what codes are dissimilar and why they're dissimilar. But again, harmonization to the furthest extent possible. I know that in the feedback that we're getting from our North Atlantic and North America Regional Coordination Group is that they understand that there will be some differences, and they're ready for their differences. They'll be prepared for them, and we just have to communicate at the appropriate time what those differences are.
Yeah, really good input. And I think you just hit on something that I've been thinking about since we started this topic, but it's around training, right? And so we have operators and industry, but we also have our airport partners who are issuing these NOTAMs, and the education and outreach is going to need to be done there. So maybe a question for Jennifer, Jerry Gross, Jerry Torres. Will any of the improvements or standardizations have an impact or change on those who issue NOTAMs? That's, our airport operators, and what kind of education and outreach are we thinking about with respect to that community and helping to share those changes and help them work through them?
Yeah, so that's certainly an item on our checklist to do, on things to do, because we realize that there's going to be some training required when we go into the new operations for ICAO, particularly on the airport operators. On my team, I do have a designated liaison to work with them to ensure the harmonization on the between the NOTAM policy order and the advisory circulars that go out. We want to make sure that they're in sync, so that way there's no misunderstanding or deviation. A point I'd like to highlight, as you know, because NOTAMs are so important, and the reason why we have a standard convention assigned is because we want to reduce at least the potential for misunderstanding, because there's always that potential where people tend to be subjective or interpret it on their own. So that's one of the reasons why we have a set of standards to at least when you put together a NOTAM that is clearly understood by everyone. And which is really, that's the most difficult part, because sometimes if you have ambiguity in that NOTAM, that certainly in itself presents a hazard. So that's just a point that I want to mention concerning that. But the training is important, and that's certainly on our checklist that we're going to be working together with the Office of Airports to ensure not only with them, but to make sure that we have that outreach necessary for the training, that it does support the implementation of ICAO.
And Heidi, if you don't mind, I will add, we are planning an extensive outreach campaign. Most of that, all documents or artifacts will be posted on the ICAO NOTAM website. If you do have events or suggestions that you think would be a great opportunity for us to start briefing the aviation operators and community, we're open to start, prioritizing which ones will not meet, but where we'll be able to reach the largest audience. I do know that we're planning to update, for example, NOTAM Manager and to all the user guides. We'll do briefings, whatever's necessary to make sure our airport operators are aware of the new format, just so they're comfortable, because it may end up having a bigger impact to the airport operator community than it's going to have to the pilot community.
And Jen, I think we have a next hour to talk to our airport partners. So I think this is a discussion as we enter that next panel. I think we have one more question we'll try to quickly tackle before we wrap up this session. So maybe to you, Jerry Gross, how is the plain text version of NOTAMs determined? And is it entered by the originator of the NOTAM?
Yeah, so that option on the NOTAM entry platform, that option is available for plain text. Only to at least on those items that are already covered by the established conventions and pull-down menu, that's always as an option there. although that injects in itself some variables in there that we really would like to adhere to a standard, there rather than, because the free text is also tends to give us some headaches in regards to that. But, and I don't know if that option will ever go away, because there's always that situation that's not addressed by the established conventions there, that they may have to use a free text to specifically describe a situation that's impacting that particular, facility.
Yeah, and Jerry, I think there's a difference maybe here between plain text and free text, right? We have free text where you
Free text.
put in free
Okay.
text. This was around plain text version, so
Okay,
plain
gotcha.
language, which is something that typically occurs at the vendor level, right? I mean, it's after the NOTAM has been originated by the NOTAM originator, correct?
Correct. So I understand the desire for NOTAMs to be easier to understand, in other words, readable and what have you. But that in itself presents a challenge, because in the United States, of course, the automation system, we could, maximize or optimize the amount of text that we can put in there. However, we are limited by the ICAO states in terms of their automation system to have a lot of the, the text added, which increases the pages of NOTAMs as well, by the way. But that's one of the challenges that, like I said, I want to say that we have with ICAO, because not all member states are equal in terms of their abilities for automation. And a good example that I can give you is on that challenge that we have on the rollover thing. A simple solution would be just to add another digit, and it should be taken care of. However, we're sort of anchored to the lowest denominator there, and by member states to then making sure that we at least, hit that majority that are able to process that information. So that's an example in terms of that, the limitations imposed by the member states as internal systems.
Thanks, Jerry. Lots of good insight, and I think things that we're going to have to talk about into the future. James, I think we're going to go over to you to get us wrapped up, sir.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. We probably could go 4 hours, which is why my first plug will be my last plug, the ad hoc session. A really great place to keep these conversations going. Appreciate again our partners to the north, Nav Canada. Thank you for this conversation and previous ones and the continued ones in the future. We can benefit from all of our partners in the global aviation community. So thanks again for making time for this, Caroline, and your team. So similar challenges for Nav Canada: technological, procedural, cultural is what I wrote down. And I think that there isn't enough time in one of these forums to address it. There can be too many codes, not enough codes. Making the information direct and understood, but making it also open to allow for the variations. I mean, bottom line, I wrote down here for myself in my own notes was, with the benefits of standardization comes the detriments of standardization, right? So, we want standard as long as it's a standard that applies best to my operation and to my ANSP, which is, not possible in a global community. And this is good. This is a good opportunity for us to become more harmonized globally, because this is where we're trying to go as an organization and a global aviation community. So Q code mapping remains a risk and other things. So I took a couple actions. I'm going to run through my list of things I think we need to follow up on here. Of course, first and foremost, let's capture all the chat questions. I want to make sure if we can give a technical answer to a technical question, we do. And if not, it becomes a topic for discussion at the ad hoc session. The question remains on multi-part NOTAMs, and I think that's again another ad hoc discussion to further that conversation. Can more be done around some sort of confirmation that the legality disclaimers can be accepted and don't have to be put in every time? And Jerry, I defer to your wisdom in the policy piece, but I think that would be a great discussion to continue in the ad hoc. To share what we intend to cross over for ICAO, and also the lessons learned with other ANSPs. I think capturing those and keeping that as a rolling FAQ or Q&A for us, Jennifer, might be nice in the ICAO structure and the ad hoc, just to keep the information going on and on and on. I love the idea of considering some demos, tests as an idea for the ad hoc. Maybe we can find some folks that can do some parallel operational testing, get some pilots, get some folks to review what it would look like in ICAO and tell us how much sense it makes to you. We have this great period now between now and the late 2024 timeframe in the winter there to really work this out. And we really don't have that much runway, honestly, left. So I think the parallel operations and demos and tests could be a great idea. And then the outreach, training, communications plans, both with airports, operators, industry leads, pilots. There's a lot to be shared there. I know we've got a lot planned, and it's an area where I know that we need to focus a little bit more on inside the agency to clearly lay out to this community how we're going to be getting the word out. And with your support and partnership, how we make sure we don't miss anybody in that communications of how it affects them. There were some questions in the chat about how will this affect people entering the NOTAMs? How will this affect, the people who aren't using the NOTAM managing system? There's a lot of questions here that we've got to go work. So that was my quick list of actions. Heidi, did anything stand out to you that I missed?
No, I think you captured a great list, James. Completely agree. I'm not going to extend it further other than to say, gave us a lot to think about for our next ad hoc meeting, right?
Yeah.
Most of the things that I saw in the chat feature, the discussions we've had here, are all going to be future ad hoc discussions. They're things that we need to expand upon. One that a quick answer doesn't necessarily resolve or allow for the discussion that we all want to happen. And I think we would probably benefit from Carolyn's input into our ad hoc at different stages. I think there's a lot of lessons learned there that I think all of us could benefit from. So really appreciated everybody on the panel. A good discussion. I know we're going to reconvene at 2:45 for our final airports panel. I think we had some great discussions that are going to lend perfectly into that next segment. So we hope that you'll stick around, stay with us. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to the panel. Really appreciate it. Talk to you
Great
again.
job. Thanks, everybody.